Where did you get this?" The words shook the silence of a billionaire's mansion as an empire builder crumbled at the sight of a child's necklace. For decades, Harrison Covington was the face of power in America. A self-made billionaire, he built an empire of steel and glass, yet lived surrounded by silence inside his mansion on the Hudson. To the outside world, he was untouchable, a monument of success. But behind closed doors, Harrison carried a secret, one tied to a frozen battlefield half a century ago. Then, on what seemed like an ordinary afternoon, a 10-year-old girl walked into his library wearing a simple necklace. What happened next shattered the fortress around his heart and exposed a truth his family was desperate to bury. This is the story of how a forgotten dog tag uncovered a legacy that could change everything. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. A legacy of iron and steel could not mend a heart broken by ghosts. This was the truth for Harrison Covington, a man who commanded empires from a lonely throne. Now, a simple piece of metal worn by a child threatened to reveal a secret buried for over half a century. Harrison Covington was a monument of a man, carved from the same granite and resolve that built his billion-dollar construction empire. At 85 years old, his life was a fortress of routine and quiet authority. His world was one of sprawling blueprints, the distant rumble of machinery, and the hushed deference of his staff. He lived in a stone mansion on the Hudson River, a place so vast and silent it often felt more like a museum than a home. Every morning, a valet laid out a perfectly pressed suit. Every meal was served on porcelain that was older than most countries. Every decision he made could shift skylines and economies. Yet, for all his power, Harrison was profoundly alone, a king in a gilded cage, haunted by the echoes of a life lived long ago. His wife, Eleanor, had been gone for 20 years, and the laughter that once filled the cavernous halls had faded into memory. His only son, Robert, was a man who had inherited his father's name, but not his character. Robert was sharp, ambitious, and saw the family business not as a legacy, but as a treasure chest to be plundered. Harrison saw the cold calculation in his son's eyes and knew the empire he had built with his bare hands would one day become just another asset in a portfolio. The mansion was kept running by a small, efficient staff who moved through the rooms with quiet respect. Among them was Rosa Martinez, a woman whose gentle presence was a small comfort in the sterile environment. She had worked for Mr. Covington for 5 years, cleaning the endless corridors and polishing furniture that was worth more than her entire life's earnings. Rosa was a widow, raising her 10-year-old daughter, Maya, on her own. She was a good woman, diligent and invisible, which was the highest compliment a member of the Covington staff could receive. Occasionally, when Maya's school was closed or the babysitter was unavailable, Rosa had no choice but to bring her daughter to work. She would give Maya a book and sit her in a small, out-of-the-way alcove near the kitchens, with strict instructions not to wander and not to touch anything. Maya was a bright, curious child with wide, observant eyes. She understood that this was a different world, a world of beautiful, fragile things that were not meant for her. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, Rosa was dusting the Grand Library, a magnificent 2-story room lined with thousands of leather-bound books. It was Harrison's sanctuary, the one place he felt a connection to the past. Maya sat quietly on a footstool, engrossed in a story about knights and dragons. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and lemon oil. Harrison entered the library, his movements slow and deliberate, aided by a simple mahogany cane. He didn't notice the child at first. His focus was on the large bay window that overlooked the dormant winter gardens. He stood there for a long moment, his shoulders stooped with a weight no one could see. He was thinking of a different winter, a different lifetime, in the frozen fields of Korea. He was thinking of the bone-deep cold and the fear that was a constant companion. He was thinking of his friend. "Mama, can I have some water?" Maya's small voice was a clear bell in the silence. Rosa, startled, immediately shushed her daughter. "Maya, I told you to be quiet." "I'm so sorry, Mr. Covington." Harrison turned, his gaze finally falling on the little girl. She was looking up at her mother, and as she did, something on her chest caught the afternoon light streaming through the window. a glint of metal. It was a simple, weathered dog tag, hanging from a tarnished ball chain around her neck. Harrison's entire body went rigid. The air left his lungs in a sudden, sharp gasp. The world around him seemed to slow down, the motes of dust dancing in the sunbeams freezing in place. He took a hesitant step forward, his old eyes, usually clouded with the detached gaze of a commander, now sharp and intensely focused. He pointed a trembling finger at the dog tag. His voice, when it came, was not the powerful baritone that commanded boardrooms, but a raw, broken whisper, a sound no one had heard from him in 50 years. Where did you get that?" Rosa rushed to her daughter's side, a look of alarm on her face. She thought Maya had perhaps touched something she shouldn't have. "I'm sorry, sir. It's just an old thing. It's nothing." But Harrison's eyes never left the piece of metal. He could see it clearly now. The dent in the upper right corner. The faint scratches near the hole where the chain went through. He knew those marks better than he knew the lines on his own hand. He stumbled forward, his cane clattering against the polished hardwood floor. He dropped to one knee in front of the child, an act that sent a shock of pain through his old joints. He didn't care. He had to be closer. "Please," he rasped, his hand reaching out, not to touch the dog tag, but as if to touch a ghost. "Let me see it." Maya, frightened by the old man's sudden intensity, shrank back against her mother's legs. Rosa put a protective arm around her daughter, her heart pounding. "Mr. Covington, you're scaring her." "The name," Harrison pleaded, his eyes swimming with tears that had been held back for decades. "What is the name on the tag?" Maya, sensing the deep, aching sorrow in the man's voice, looked down at the tag herself. She had worn it for as long as she could remember. Her mother had told her it belonged to a hero, a man who was family. She traced the raised letters with her small finger and read the name aloud, her voice clear and innocent. "It says, O'Connell. Michael J." The name struck Harrison like a physical blow. A choked sob escaped his lips. The fortress he had built around his heart, a structure fortified by years of loss, power, and emotional distance, crumbled into dust. The stoic billionaire, the titan of industry, knelt on the floor of his library and wept. He wept with the unrestrained, gut-wrenching grief of a young man who had just lost his best friend in the mud and snow of a forgotten war. The sound echoed in the silent, cavernous room, a testament to a pain that time had never healed. Rosa and Maya could only watch in stunned silence as the powerful old man broke down completely, all for a name on a little girl's necklace. The silence that followed Harrison's breakdown was heavy and fragile. Rosa stood frozen, her hand resting on Maya's shoulder, trying to process the scene unfolding before her. She had only ever seen Mr. Covington as a distant, formidable figure, a force of nature, not a man who could be brought to his knees by a name. His sobs slowly subsided into ragged, shuddering breaths. He remained on the floor, his head bowed, his large, wrinkled hands covering his face. "Mama," Maya whispered, her own eyes wide with a mixture of fear and empathy. "Is he okay?" Rosa didn't know how to answer. She knelt beside her daughter and spoke softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Covington, sir? Can I get you some water? Should I call someone?" Harrison slowly lowered his hands. His face was a wreck of emotion, his eyes red-rimmed and hollowed out by a grief that was half a century old, but as fresh as if it were yesterday. He looked at the dog tag again, then at Maya's innocent face, and finally at Rosa's concerned one. "No," he said, his voice hoarse. "Don't call anyone. Just please, tell me about the necklace. About Michael." Rosa hesitated. This was a story she held close to her heart, a piece of family lore that felt too sacred to share in this grand, imposing room. But looking at the raw pain on Harrison Covington's face, she felt she had no choice. "It belonged to my grandfather," she explained quietly. "His name was Michael O'Connell. My mother gave it to Maya when she was born. She said it was to let her grandfather watch over her, to keep her safe." "Your grandfather," Harrison repeated, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. He had known Michael, or Mikey, as he'd called him, as a brother. They were just boys then, barely 20, shivering in foxholes and sharing stories of the lives they planned to live when they got home. Mikey had talked about his girl back in Brooklyn, a sweetheart named Maria, but he'd never mentioned having a child. The war had ended, and they had gone their separate ways with a promise to write, a promise swallowed by the chaos of returning to a world that no longer made sense. Harrison had written, but his letters were returned, stamped, address unknown. He had searched, hiring a private detective in those early years, but Michael O'Connell seemed to have vanished. He died a long time ago, Rosa continued, her voice soft with a second-hand sorrow. Before my mother was even born. My grandmother, Maria, she told my mom he died in an accident at a construction site a few months after he got back from the war. She was already pregnant with my mother then. She never remarried. She said there could only ever be one Michael. Harrison felt a fresh wave of grief wash over him. Mikey was dead. All these years, he had held on to a sliver of hope that his friend was out there somewhere, living a quiet, happy life. To learn he had died so young, so tragically, and so alone, it was a wound ripped open anew. And to learn he had a family, a legacy that Harrison never knew existed. He was my friend, Harrison said, the confession feeling inadequate to describe the bond they had shared. He was my brother. He saved my life in Korea. He struggled to his feet, his old bones protesting. He looked around the library, at the priceless artifacts, the first edition books, the monuments to his own success. It all felt like dust and ashes. For 50 years, he had believed he was the sole survivor of that friendship, the keeper of their shared memories. Now, he found that a whole family had been living in the shadows of his ignorance, a family that should have been his. Just as the emotional weight in the room seemed to settle into a fragile understanding, the library doors swung open with a decisive bang. In strode Robert Covington, Harrison's son, followed by his impeccably dressed wife, Tiffany. Robert was in his late 50s, with his father's sharp features, but none of the underlying warmth. His eyes were cold, constantly assessing, calculating. Tiffany trailed behind him, a woman whose smile was as polished and hard as the diamonds on her fingers. Father, Robert's voice was clipped, laced with impatience. We have the Henderson merger meeting in less than an hour. What's the delay? Charles said you were in here. His eyes swept the room, taking in the scene with unconcealed disdain. He saw his father, looking disheveled and emotionally spent. He saw the maid, kneeling on the floor. And he saw the child, a grubby little intruder in their pristine world. His gaze lingered for a moment on the girl's necklace. What is all this? He demanded, his tone shifting from impatience to suspicion. Why is she here? And why does the help have their children running around your office? Tiffany glided forward, a look of theatrical concern on her face. Harrison, darling, you look pale. Has something happened? Has this woman upset you? She directed a withering glare at Rosa, as if her mere presence was an offense. Before Harrison could speak, to explain the impossible, miraculous discovery he had just made, Robert's sharp eyes noticed the object of his father's attention. What is that around the girl's neck? A dog tag. He let out a short, dismissive laugh. Don't tell me you're getting sentimental over some old army trinket. Harrison's back straightened. The formidable patriarch returned, his grief momentarily eclipsed by a flash of the iron will that had built an empire. This is not some old army trinket, Robert. This belonged to Sergeant Michael O'Connell. He turned to Rosa and Maya, his expression softening. And this is his granddaughter, Rosa, and his great-granddaughter, Maya. The statement landed in the room with the force of a grenade. Robert stared at his father, his expression shifting from confusion to incredulous disbelief. Tiffany let out a delicate, mocking gasp. Michael O'Connell? Robert scoffed, a cynical smirk twisting his lips. The man from your war stories? Father, you can't be serious. You haven't seen him in what, 60 years? You told me you lost touch. I didn't lose touch, Harrison said, his voice dangerously low. I was led to believe he had disappeared. Now I have found his family. Tiffany stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she inspected Maya, as if she were a piece of cheap costume jewelry. Oh, Harrison, this is absurd. A maid and her child show up, and suddenly they're the long-lost relatives of your army buddy? How incredibly convenient. Her voice was like honey laced with poison. This smells like a setup. She's an opportunist, darling. She's heard your stories, and she's playing on your grief to get her hands on your money. Rosa, who had been silent and intimidated, found her voice. She stood up, pulling Maya behind her, her dignity flaring in the face of their accusations. I would never do such a thing, she said, her voice trembling but firm. I did not know who Mr. Covington was to my grandfather. This dog tag is a memory of a hero. It is not for sale. Silence, Robert snapped, waving a dismissive hand at her as if shooing away an insect. He turned back to his father, his tone becoming one of feigned reason. Father, think about this rationally. You're being emotional. This woman, this employee, makes a wild claim, and you're ready to welcome her into the family? It's transparent. It's a classic gold digger scheme. This isn't about money, Robert. This is about my friend. It's about my honor. Harrison's voice boomed through the library, rattling the crystal glasses on a nearby cart. He saved my life, and I never got to thank him. I never got to meet his family. I failed him. Alleged family. Tiffany corrected smoothly, stepping beside her husband to form a united, hostile front. A claim this extraordinary requires extraordinary proof. Not just a sob story and a rusty piece of tin. The air crackled with tension. The library was no longer a sanctuary of memory, but a courtroom, and Rosa and her 10-year-old daughter were the ones on trial. Humiliation burned on Rosa's cheeks. These wealthy, cruel people were looking at her and her child as if they were vermin, a threat to be neutralized. Harrison looked from the cynical, accusing faces of his son and daughter-in-law to the frightened but proud face of Rosa and the wide, innocent eyes of the little girl wearing his best friend's name around her neck. He knew in his gut, with a certainty that defied logic, that this was real. But he also knew the world his son inhabited, a world of lawsuits, challenges, and brutal, merciless calculation. They are right about one thing, Harrison said, his voice heavy with resignation. He looked at Rosa, his expression a mixture of apology and grim determination. Not because I doubt you. In my heart, I know you are his blood. But to silence them, to make it official, undeniable. He took a deep breath, the words feeling like a betrayal of the sacred moment he had just experienced. We will do a DNA test. The demand for a DNA test hung in the air, a clinical, cold solution to a matter of the heart. To Robert and Tiffany, it was a necessary, strategic move, a way to expose the fraud they were so certain was being perpetrated. To Harrison, it was a painful concession to the cynical world his son represented. But to Rosa, it felt like an accusation, a formal declaration that her family's story, her mother's memories, and her grandfather's legacy were all considered lies until proven otherwise. She clutched Maya's hand tightly, her knuckles white. Her first instinct was to refuse, to grab her daughter and flee this house of marble and suspicion, to protect their quiet life from the corrosive influence of such immense wealth and distrust. She didn't want their money. She had never asked for anything but a steady paycheck for her honest work. I don't understand, Rosa stammered, looking at Harrison. You want to take my daughter's sample? The word felt invasive, scientific, and terrifying. Robert stepped forward, taking control of the situation with the cool efficiency of a corporate raider. It's a simple cheek swab, nothing to be alarmed about. We'll use my mother's old hairbrush from her vanity. It will still have viable follicles. We will compare the girl's DNA to my late mother's. If your grandfather and my father were not related, we will use a lab that specializes in grandparentage testing against Mr. Covington. The lab we use is the best in the country. The results will be irrefutable. He spoke as if arranging a business transaction, his tone leaving no room for argument. Tiffany added, with a saccharine smile, "It's for your own protection, dear. If your claim is true, it will legitimize you. If not," she let the sentence hang, the unspoken threat clear, "it will expose you as a fraud, and you will be ruined." Amelia felt trapped. To refuse the test would be an admission of guilt in their eyes. It would confirm every vile suspicion they had. But to agree felt like surrendering a piece of her daughter's dignity, of their family's private history, to these cold, hostile people. She looked at her daughter, Maya, who was watching the exchange with a child's unfiltered clarity. Maya wasn't thinking about money or legitimacy. She just saw that the kind old man was sad, and the other two adults were angry. Then Rosa looked at Harrison. The deep, pleading pain in his eyes swayed her. This wasn't just about his son's suspicions. For Harrison, this was about finding a connection to a past he thought was lost forever. It was about honoring a debt to a friend. He needed this to be real, and he needed a way to prove it to the world, and perhaps even to himself. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Rosa lifted her chin and met Robert's icy gaze. "Fine. she said, her voice clear and firm, all trace of hesitation gone. Do the test. You will see. We are not liars. Excellent, Robert said with a curt, satisfied nod, as if a subordinate had finally agreed to a difficult but necessary task. Our family lawyer, Mr. Peterson, will be in touch to arrange everything. He will oversee the collection of the samples to ensure a proper chain of custody. He then turned to his father, his tone becoming authoritative. Until we have the results, which will take a week or two, I must insist that you keep your distance. Do not offer this woman or her child anything. No money, no gifts, nothing. For all we know, this is an elaborate scam, and they could disappear the moment they get what they want. Before Harrison could object, to rage against the implication that his best friend's family were common thieves, another, more shocking declaration was made. She won't have the chance to disappear, Tiffany announced, a triumphant gleam in her eye. She and the child will stay here, in this house. Everyone, including Robert, looked at her in surprise. Are you insane? Robert muttered. Not at all, darling. Tiffany purred, turning to Harrison. Think of it, Harrison. It's the perfect solution. We can keep an eye on them. Make sure they don't run off and sell their story to some dreadful tabloid. We will put them in the old staff quarters in the East Wing. They will be guests, under our supervision. It was a brilliant, cruel move. On the surface, it looked like an act of cautious generosity. In reality, it was a prison sentence. It would isolate Rosa and Maya, placing them directly under the hostile watch of Tiffany and Robert. It was a power play, designed to intimidate and control them. Harrison saw the trap immediately, but he also saw a glimmer of an opportunity. It would keep Maya and Rosa close. It would give him a chance, however supervised, to get to know them, to hear more stories about Mikey. They will not stay in the staff quarters, Harrison declared, his voice ringing with an authority that had been momentarily absent. He pointed to a hallway that led to a series of luxurious suites. They will stay in the blue suite, as my honored guests. And you, Robert, and you, Tiffany, will treat them with respect. That is not a request. A look of fury flashed across Robert's face, but he held his tongue. Tiffany's smile tightened, but she gave a slight, acquiescent nod. The battle lines had been drawn. The wait for the DNA results was no longer just a waiting period. It was a ceasefire in a war that had just begun. The next few days unfolded in a haze of surreal tension. Rosa and Maya moved out of their small, two-bedroom apartment in Yonkers and into the blue suite at the Covington estate. The suite was larger than their entire apartment, with silk wallpaper, a four-poster bed, and a marble bathroom with gold-plated taps. For 10-year-old Maya, it was a fairy tale come to life. She was convinced she had moved into a castle. She discovered the mansion's heated indoor swimming pool, the small private movie theater, and the sprawling gardens that were a wonderland of hidden paths and ancient trees. She even managed to coax a rare smile from Charles, the stern-faced butler who had served the Covington family for 40 years. The boyish energy and bright laughter she brought to the silent halls were a novelty the old house hadn't experienced in decades. For Rosa, however, the mansion felt like a beautiful, gilded cage. She was a guest who was not allowed to leave the grounds without permission. She was the potential matriarch of a lost family line, yet the household staff, taking their cues from Robert and Tiffany, treated her with a cold, formal distance that bordered on contempt. She was a specimen under a microscope, her every move watched and judged. Robert and Tiffany were relentless in their subtle campaign of psychological warfare. Tiffany would make backhanded compliments about how well-behaved Maya was, as if she were a new pet being house-trained. She would talk loudly on the phone to her society friends about the importance of good breeding and proper background checks. Robert, meanwhile, treated Rosa as if she were invisible, walking past her in the hallways without a word of acknowledgement. Their message was clear: you do not belong here. Harrison, on the other hand, did everything he could to bridge the chasm of 60 years. He was caught between his son's hostile vigilance and his own desperate need to connect. He would arrange for accidental meetings in the library or the garden. He'd ask Maya about school and what books she was reading. He was awkward and clumsy in his attempts, a man used to dealing with contracts and balance sheets, not the delicate heart of a child. One afternoon, he found Maya sitting on a bench by the frozen fountain, sketching in a notepad. He sat down beside her, his joints creaking. "What are you drawing?" he asked, his voice gentle. The angel, Maya said, pointing her pencil at the stone seraph in the center of the fountain. She looks lonely. Harrison looked at the statue, and then back at the girl. A lot of things in this house are lonely, he said softly. He saw the dog tag resting against her sweater. Your great-grandfather, he began, his voice thick with memory. He liked to draw, too. He wasn't very good at it, but he was always sketching. He'd draw cartoons of our commanding officer. Drove him crazy. A small, sad smile touched Harrison's lips. He found a way to make us laugh, even when we were scared and freezing cold. He was the bravest man I ever knew. He spent the next hour telling Maya stories about Michael O'Connell. He told her about Mikey's uncanny ability to find an extra can of peaches when rations were low, about the time he rigged a makeshift radio to listen to a baseball game from halfway across the world, and about the night he dragged a wounded Harrison 3 miles through enemy territory to a field hospital. As he spoke, the legendary, almost mythical figure of Maya's great-grandfather transformed into a real person, a laughing, brave, clever young man. A fragile bond began to form between the old billionaire and the little girl, a bond woven from shared blood and stories of a forgotten hero. Meanwhile, in their own opulent wing of the mansion, Robert and Tiffany were plotting. The growing connection between Harrison and the Martinez girl was a catastrophic threat to their inheritance and their future. He's completely besotted with the child, Tiffany hissed, pacing back and forth on an expensive Persian rug. He looks at her and sees his dead friend. She's a walking, talking piece of nostalgia, and he's eating it up. He's already had his lawyer on the phone. I heard him talking about trusts and estates. The DNA results are still a week away, Robert said, his face a mask of cold fury. He stood by the window, staring out at his father walking in the garden with Maya. We can't wait for the test to prove she's a fake. By then, the emotional damage will be done. He'll be too attached. We need to discredit the mother. We need to find something, some piece of dirt from her past that proves she's untrustworthy. Something that will make him see her as a conniving grifter, not the Madonna she pretends to be. Tiffany's eyes, which were constantly scanning for threats and opportunities, gleamed with a cruel intelligence. Everyone has secrets, darling. Especially people who have struggled. People who live paycheck to paycheck get desperate. They cut corners, they make mistakes. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts. I know a man. Frank Nolan. He's a private investigator. Not the most ethical man, but he is very, very good at digging. If there's a skeleton in Rosa Martinez's closet, he'll find it. She smiled, a sharp, predatory expression. And if there isn't one, well, for the right price, I'm sure Mr. Nolan is creative enough to put one there. Frank Nolan was a creature of the shadows, a man who thrived on the secrets people tried to bury. He operated out of a cramped, dusty office in a less reputable part of the city, his only companions a dying potted plant and the low hum of a computer that had seen better days. When Tiffany Covington's call came in, he recognized the scent of money and desperation, his two favorite things. Digging up dirt on a single mother working as a maid should have been child's play. Nolan started with the basics: public records, credit history, social media. Rosa Martinez's life was painfully, disappointingly clean. She paid her rent on time. She had no criminal record, not even a parking ticket. Her credit score was decent, a testament to a frugal, carefully managed life. Her online presence consisted of a sparsely used social media profile, filled mostly with pictures of Maya's school projects and birthday parties. There were no disgruntled ex-boyfriends, no shady past employers, no hidden debts. She was exactly what she appeared to be, a hard-working, devoted mother. Frustrated, Nolan reported his lack of findings to Tiffany. Her response was sharp and dismissive. I am not paying you for what is publicly available, Mr. Nolan. I am paying you to dig. Go to her old neighborhood. Talk to her neighbors. Look into her late husband. No one is that clean. Find something, or create something. I don't care which. The veiled instruction was clear. Nolan packed a bag and drove to Yonkers, to the modest apartment building Rosa and Maya had called home. He moved with a practiced insincerity, adopting the persona of a friendly insurance investigator or a long-lost cousin, depending on his audience. He spoke to the grumpy superintendent, who complained only that Rosa had always paid her rent early. He interviewed the elderly woman next door, who gushed about what a polite, well-behaved child Maya was, and how Rosa always helped her carry her groceries. He found nothing but a trail of quiet decency. His last stop was a small, family-run grocery store at the end of the block, a place where Rosa had shopped for years. The owner, a balding, portly man named Mr. Chun, recognized her picture immediately. "Ah, Rosa," he said with a warm smile. "A good woman. Very honest. Her daughter, Maya, such a sweet girl." Nolan, posing as an old family friend, bought a soda and leaned against the counter. "It's been so long since I've seen her. I heard she had a rough time after her husband. Carlos, was it? Passed away." Mr. Chin's smile faltered. He began wiping down the already spotless counter, his gaze averted. "Yes, a tragedy. He was a good man, a construction worker. Fell from a scaffold. Left her with the little one and a mountain of hospital bills." Nolan sensed the shift in the man's demeanor. This was it. The first crack in the pristine facade. Hospital bills? I thought a workplace accident like that would be covered by the company, by insurance. Mr. Chun sighed heavily, the sound of a man burdened by a story he didn't want to tell. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "It should have been. But there were complications. Rumors. The construction company, they are a big, powerful outfit. They said that he had been drinking on the job, that he was negligent." Nolan's pulse quickened. Drinking? Really? Was that true? Mr. Chin shrugged, a look of deep sadness in his eyes. "Who knows? Carlos liked a beer after work, like any man. But on the job? I never saw him that way." But the company produced a witness, another worker who swore he saw Carlos drinking that morning. And they had a blood test from the hospital. It was all very official. The insurance claim was denied. The company paid for the funeral, but that was it. Rosa was left with nothing. She fought it for a little while, hired a lawyer, but she had no money, no power. The lawyer told her it was hopeless. She had to give up. He shook his head, his voice filled with a quiet anger. She sold her car, her wedding ring, everything, just to pay the bills. It was a very hard time for her. But she never complained. She just worked, always for her daughter. Nolan left the store, a grim smile of triumph on his face. This was it. This was the dirt Tiffany Covington had paid for. The story of a disgraced, alcoholic husband. It was a perfect piece of ammunition. It didn't matter if it was true. All that mattered was that it was on a record, in a file somewhere. It was a seed of doubt, a stain on the family's honor. He could twist this. He could paint Rosa not as a grieving widow, but as the wife of a drunk, a woman desperate enough to concoct an elaborate lie to escape a life of struggle. He dialed Tiffany's number. "I think I have what you're looking for." While Frank Nolan was unearthing the painful ghosts of Rosa's past, the fragile, tentative peace within the Covington mansion was beginning to feel almost real. The looming DNA test became a background hum rather than a screeching alarm. Harrison, starved for the family connection he had been denied for a lifetime, soaked up every moment with Maya. He discovered she had a keen, inquisitive mind. He took her to the mansion's observatory, a dusty, forgotten room at the top of the east wing, and showed her how to work the massive brass telescope. Together, they looked at the craters on the moon and the distant, glittering rings of Saturn. He told her how he and Mikey used to lie in the fields on their family farms, staring up at the same stars, wondering what their futures held. He wanted to be an architect, Harrison told her one evening, his voice a low rumble in the dark, quiet observatory. He was always drawing buildings. Said he wanted to build things that would last, things that would make people feel safe. He looked over at Maya, her small face illuminated by the faint starlight filtering through the dome. "I think that's why I went into construction. After he was gone, it felt like I was trying to finish his dream for him." Rosa watched these moments from a distance, her heart a tangled knot of hope and fear. It was beautiful to see her daughter so happy, to see this powerful, lonely old man open his heart. But she couldn't shake the feeling that it was all temporary, a beautiful dream from which they would soon be brutally awakened. The condescending glares from Tiffany and the cold silence from Robert were constant reminders that they were on borrowed time. One rainy afternoon, just 2 days before the DNA results were due, the storm broke. Rosa, Harrison, and Maya were in the sunroom, working on a large jigsaw puzzle of a European castle. It was a peaceful, domestic scene, something the Covington mansion hadn't witnessed in years. Laughter echoed in the glass-paned room as Maya, triumphantly fitted a tricky piece into place. Suddenly, Robert and Tiffany entered, their faces set like stone. They didn't just walk in. They made an entrance, their presence immediately sucking all the warmth and light from the room. Tiffany was holding a manila folder, clutching it like a weapon. "Father," Robert began, his voice devoid of any warmth. "We need to talk. Now." Harrison looked up, his brief moment of peace shattered. "Whatever you have to say, Robert, you can say it in front of Rosa and Maya." "I think not," Tiffany said, her voice sharp and cold. She took a step forward and slapped the folder down on the puzzle table, scattering the loose pieces. "This concerns the character, or lack thereof, of your new friends." Harrison stared at the folder, then at Tiffany's triumphant, cruel face. "What is the meaning of this?" "This," she announced to the room, "is a private investigator's report on one Rosa Martinez, and it makes for very interesting reading." Rosa felt the blood drain from her face. She stood up, her hands trembling. "What have you done?" "We've done our due diligence," Robert said, his arms crossed, a smug look on his face. "Something you should have done, Father, before you let these people into your home, before you started promising them the world." Tiffany opened the folder and began to read aloud, her voice dripping with malicious satisfaction. "Carlos Martinez, deceased husband of Rosa Martinez, died in a workplace accident in 2015. Cause of death was ruled a consequence of his own negligence due to intoxication. Blood alcohol level was 0.15, nearly double the legal limit." She looked up, her eyes locking onto Rosa's. "It seems your heroic family line has some less than heroic members. Your husband, Rosa, was a drunk who got himself killed and left you with nothing." The words hit Rosa like a physical blow. It was the old lie, the corporate slander that had ruined their lives, now unearthed and thrown in her face in this beautiful, sunlit room. The shame and helplessness she had felt all those years ago came rushing back. "That's not true," she cried, her voice breaking. "He wasn't drunk. The company lied. They paid someone to say that. They falsified the report to avoid paying the insurance." "Of course, that's what you'd say," Robert sneered. "It's always someone else's fault. It's a classic story. A woman from a disadvantaged background, saddled with the debts of a dead, alcoholic husband. Desperate. Sees an opportunity with a lonely, sentimental old man. It's all starting to make sense now, isn't it, Father?" Maya, who had been watching in terrified confusion, ran to her mother's side and buried her face in her skirt, starting to cry. Harrison looked from the cruel, triumphant faces of his son and daughter-in-law to the devastated, tear-streaked face of Rosa, who was trying to comfort her sobbing child. He saw the file, the official-looking papers, the cold, hard facts they presented. But then he looked into Rosa's eyes, and he saw not the duplicity of a grifter, but the deep, wounded pride of a woman who had been unjustly wronged. He saw the same fire, the same unwavering decency he had seen in his friend Michael O'Connell all those years ago. He rose slowly to his full height, his presence filling the room with a sudden, immense authority. The gentle, storytelling grandfather was gone, replaced by the titan of industry who could crush men like his son without a second thought. "Get out," he said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. Robert and Tiffany were taken aback. They had expected capitulation, doubt, a slow turning against the interlopers. They had not expected this. "Father, be reasonable," Robert stammered. "Just look at the evidence." "I said, get out," Harrison roared, pointing a trembling but resolute finger toward the door. "Both of you, get out of this room. Get out of my sight. You have brought shame and cruelty into this house. You have attacked a grieving woman and frightened a child. You are not my family. You are vultures." He turned his back on them, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and walked over to Rosa and Maya. He knelt, his old knees protesting, and placed a hand on Maya's shaking shoulder. "It's all right, little one," he said, his voice soft again. "It's all right. I know the truth. A piece of paper doesn't tell you who a person is. The heart does. I know who you are." Robert and Tiffany stood in stunned silence for a moment, their carefully orchestrated attack having backfired spectacularly. Then, with a look of pure hatred directed at Rosa, they turned and stormed out of the room, the sound of the heavy door slamming behind them echoing like a declaration of war. The battle was far from over. It had just entered its most dangerous phase. The slam of the sunroom door was not an ending, but the cracking of a fault line. The tremors of that confrontation radiated through the entire mansion, dividing it into armed camps. Robert and Tiffany retreated to their wing, their fury a palpable force. They were no longer just suspicious, they were at war. Their target was not just Rosa, but Harrison himself. His emotional defiance was, in their eyes, a sign of senility, of a failing mind being manipulated by a common charlatan. Their conversations, once filled with dismissive snobbery, now took on the cold, precise language of legal strategy. He's lost his mind, Robert seethed, pacing their suite. He chose a maid over his own son. He's incompetent. He's a danger to the company, to his own legacy. Then we have to act like he is, Tiffany replied, her voice dangerously calm. She was already several steps ahead, her mind a chessboard of ruthless moves. We need to talk to Peterson, not just about the DNA test, but about a competency hearing, about a conservatorship. We can argue that he's being unduly influenced, that his emotional state is making him incapable of sound financial judgment. He'll fight it, Robert said, though the idea was clearly taking root. He'll see it as the ultimate betrayal. Let him, Tiffany said, a chilling smile playing on her lips. By the time he realizes what's happening, it will be too late. We'll paint a picture of a confused old man being preyed upon by a gold digger. The story about her drunk husband is the cornerstone. We can use it to prove she has a history of desperation. We will protect this family, darling. We will protect our inheritance. Meanwhile, in the quiet aftermath of the explosion, a new, stronger alliance was being forged in the sunroom. Harrison had ordered a pot of tea and some small cakes, a simple, comforting gesture that felt profound in its normalcy. The scattered puzzle pieces lay on the table, a metaphor for the life that had been so violently disrupted. Harrison sat with Rosa, while Maya, exhausted from her tears, had fallen asleep on a plush sofa, the dog tag still clutched in her hand. I am sorry, Harrison said, his voice heavy with a shame that was not his to bear. I am so sorry for what they put you through. There is no excuse for their cruelty. Rosa looked at the old man, at the deep lines of regret etched around his eyes. In that moment, she no longer saw the billionaire, the intimidating figure of authority. She saw a father grieving for the son he had lost not to death, but to a poverty of the soul. It is not your fault, she said softly. You have been nothing but kind to us. She hesitated, then found the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her. That report they had about my husband, do you believe it? Harrison reached across the table and placed his large, weathered hand over hers. His touch was firm, reassuring. I believe you, he said, his gaze unwavering. I have spent my life judging men. I've looked into the eyes of liars, cheats, and heroes. I know what honor looks like, Rosa. I saw it in your grandfather, and I see it in you. Your husband was a victim, first of a tragic accident, and then of a heartless company that chose to protect its profits rather than a good man's name. I know that world. I've fought against men like that my entire career. A single tear traced a path down Rosa's cheek, but it was a tear of relief, not sorrow. To be seen, to be believed after so many years of carrying that quiet shame, was a gift more valuable than any fortune. What was the name of the construction company? Harrison asked, a new, hard edge to his voice. Stanton Construction, Rosa whispered. Harrison nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. He filed the name away. A debt was owed, and Harrison Covington always paid his debts. 2 days later, the air in the mansion was thick with anticipation. It was the day the DNA results were to be delivered. Charles the butler had informed Harrison that Mr. Peterson, the family's longtime lawyer, would be arriving at 3 o'clock sharp. Harrison had requested that everyone be present in the grand library. Himself, Rosa, Maya, and, to their outrage, Robert and Tiffany. The library, once a place of quiet refuge, now felt like a sterile courtroom. Robert and Tiffany sat on one side of the vast mahogany desk, a united front of grim hostility. Rosa and Maya sat on the other, close to Harrison, who sat at the head of the table like a king presiding over a deeply painful trial. Maya, sensing the immense gravity of the moment, was quiet, her hand clutching her mother's. At precisely 3 o'clock, the library doors opened and a tall, impeccably dressed man in his late 60s entered. This was Arthur Peterson, a man who had handled the Covington family's legal affairs for over 40 years. He was a man of quiet discretion and unshakable professionalism. He carried a sealed briefcase, which he placed on the center of the desk with a soft, definitive click. He greeted everyone with a polite, neutral nod, his expression unreadable. Harrison, Robert, Tiffany. His eyes lingered for a moment on Rosa and Maya, a flicker of something that might have been curiosity or compassion in their depths. "You have the results, Arthur?" Harrison asked, getting straight to the point. "I do," Peterson replied. He opened his briefcase and produced a thick, sealed envelope. "The lab couriered it to my office this morning. The chain of custody was verified at every step. The results are conclusive." A heavy silence descended upon the room. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, each tick marking a second of unbearable suspense. Tiffany leaned forward slightly, a predatory gleam in her eyes. Robert sat ramrod straight, his jaw clenched. Rosa held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs. Peterson took a letter opener from the desk and slit the envelope with methodical precision. He unfolded the document within and cleared his throat. He looked directly at Harrison. The samples were compared as requested. First, a mitochondrial DNA comparison was performed between the child, Maya Martinez, and the sample taken from Eleanor Covington's hairbrush. He paused, letting the tension build to a fever pitch. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down through the maternal line, he explained for the benefit of the room, from a mother to her children. A direct comparison can establish a shared maternal ancestor with near-perfect accuracy. He took a deep breath. The tests confirm that Maya Martinez and Eleanor Covington share a common maternal ancestor. The probability of them being related through this direct maternal line is 99.999%. The words hung in the air, irrefutable and absolute. It was true. All of it. Maya was not Eleanor's direct descendant, but the test proved she was from the same maternal bloodline as Eleanor, which meant Michael O'Connell was related to Eleanor. A soft gasp escaped Rosa's lips. She pulled Maya into a tight hug, burying her face in her daughter's hair, a wave of vindication and relief washing over her. Harrison closed his eyes for a long moment, a silent prayer of thanks on his lips. He felt a profound, bone-deep joy. His friend's legacy was not lost. It was sitting right here, in this room. But the joy was short-lived. "That's impossible," Tiffany shrieked, her voice shrill and ugly. "The test is wrong. The lab is incompetent. Or they were bribed. The laboratory is the most respected facility in the country, Tiffany," Peterson said, his voice cold and steady. "And I personally oversaw the entire process. The results are beyond question." Robert, his face pale with shock and fury, slammed his hand on the desk. "This changes nothing. So she's related to some distant cousin of my mother's. It doesn't prove the story about O'Connell. This is still a scam." "On the contrary," Peterson continued, his voice cutting through Robert's tirade. He held up another document from the envelope. "As a secondary confirmation, we also ran a Y chromosome test, comparing DNA from Harrison with genetic material from a saliva sample provided by Michael O'Connell's closest living male relative, a nephew living in Chicago we were able to locate through genealogical records. The Y chromosome is passed from father to son." He looked at Harrison. "The test confirms a 99.998% probability that you and Michael O'Connell share a common paternal grandfather." The second bombshell was even more stunning than the first. Harrison stared at his lawyer, utterly bewildered. "What? Arthur, what are you saying?" "Mikey and I, we were cousins. Second cousins, to be precise," Peterson confirmed. "Your grandfather and his grandfather were brothers. They had a falling out in the early 1900s, and the families lost touch. It seems that fate, or providence, brought two branches of the same family tree together in a foxhole in Korea, half a world away, without either of you ever knowing." The room fell into a stunned silence. This wasn't just a story about a war buddy. This was a story of family, of blood, of a connection that ran deeper than Harrison could have ever imagined. He looked at Maya, not just as his best friend's great-granddaughter, but as his own flesh and blood, his kin. The revelation was too much for Robert. All his life, he had been the sole heir, the undisputed prince of the Covington dynasty. Now, the line of succession was no longer so clear. The fortune he had always considered his own was now potentially in play. The carefully constructed world he had built for himself was crumbling before his eyes. He rose from his chair, his face contorted into a mask of pure rage and desperation. He pointed a trembling finger at Rosa. "I don't care what some test says. I will not allow this trash to lay claim to my family's name, to my inheritance." He lunged across the desk, his eyes wild, not at Rosa, but at the small, 10-year-old girl sitting beside her. "You!" He screamed at Maya, his voice cracking with madness. "You are the one who started all of this." Before anyone could react, Harrison moved with a speed that defied his age. He shot out of his chair and intercepted his son, grabbing him by the front of his expensive suit and shoving him back with astonishing force. Robert stumbled backward, tripping over a chair and crashing to the floor in a heap of undignified rage. "You will not speak to her," Harrison snarled, standing over his son, his body trembling with a righteous fury. "You will not look at her. You are no longer welcome in this house. You have forfeited the right to call yourself a Covington. You have forfeited the right to call yourself my son." He turned to his lawyer, his voice ringing with the unshakable authority that had built an empire. "Arthur," he commanded, "begin the process immediately. I want my will redrafted. I want Robert and Tiffany completely disinherited. Every stock, every property, every last cent. It is to be placed in a new trust, the O'Connell-Covington Trust. Its sole beneficiaries will be Rosa and Maya Martinez." He then looked down at his cowering son on the floor, his eyes as cold and hard as steel. "And draw up the paperwork to have him removed from the board of Covington Industries. Effective immediately." It was a corporate execution, swift and brutal. The final, irrevocable act of a king choosing his successor and banishing the traitor from his kingdom forever. The slam of the library door left a ringing silence in its wake. Robert, scrambling up from the floor, shot a look of pure venom at his father, but Harrison's face was an implacable mask of judgment. The son he saw was a stranger. Tiffany, ever the pragmatist, saw the battle was lost and pulled her husband from the room. Their retreat was not a surrender, but a tactical withdrawal to plot a new war of lawsuits and public smears. When they were gone, the immense strength Harrison had summoned seemed to desert him, and he sank into his chair, looking suddenly very old. "He was my son," he whispered to Rosa, his voice thick with a grief deeper than death. "I gave him everything. Everything but the one thing that mattered, a heart." He turned his gaze to Maya, who had watched the horrifying spectacle with wide eyes. The dog tag on her chest was a compass that had guided him back to a path of honor. He had spent his life building an empire of steel, but a true legacy, he now knew, was built of love, loyalty, and justice. And justice was long overdue. The days that followed moved with the swift, strategic precision that had made Harrison Covington a legend. An emergency board meeting was called. Robert, absent, was unceremoniously voted out of his executive position, his assets frozen, his banishment from the empire absolute. Simultaneously, Harrison unleashed his legal team on Stanton Construction. He gave them a simple mandate: uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The investigation was swift and brutal. Investigators tracked down the witness who had testified against Carlos Martinez. Faced with a perjury charge, the man confessed that Stanton Construction had paid him $20,000 to lie under oath. Next, they scrutinized the lab that had processed the blood test. A disgruntled former technician provided a sworn affidavit. The original sample had been clean. Carlos had not been drinking. The results were falsified to protect the company from a massive insurance payout. He had been a victim not of an accident, but of corporate greed. Armed with this irrefutable proof, Harrison did not just sue. He declared war. He filed a massive wrongful death lawsuit on behalf of Rosa and Maya, simultaneously leaking the entire sordid story of the cover-up to the national media. Stanton Construction's stock plummeted as federal investigators launched a criminal probe. The company, and the men who ran it, were ruined. A month later, Harrison sat with Rosa and Maya on a terrace overlooking the Hudson River. He handed Rosa a legal document, a settlement offer from Stanton's board. The number was staggering, but more important were the words printed in bold: a full, public apology and the complete exoneration of her husband's name. Rosa read the document, and a weight she had carried for years finally lifted. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with an emotion too deep for words. "You have given my husband his honor back." "Your grandfather saved my life, Rosa," Harrison replied, his gaze fixed on the setting sun. "It's taken me more than 60 years, but I'm finally paying that debt." He looked at Maya, who was leaning against his chair, reading a book. The dog tag, newly polished, shone in the fading light. The mansion, once a cold monument to a lonely man's success, slowly began to feel like a home. It filled with the scent of Rosa's cooking and the sound of Maya's laughter. Harrison taught her chess in the library, and she, in turn, taught him how to use a tablet. They were a strange and wonderful family, forged in the crucible of truth and love. One evening, Maya came to Harrison as he sat by the library fireplace. She held out the dog tag in her palm. "I think you should have this," she said. "He was your friend first." Harrison looked at the worn piece of metal. The memory of his friend, once a source of constant pain, was now a source of profound joy. He gently closed Maya's fingers over the tag. "You keep it," he said, his voice soft. "It's a reminder of where we came from, and what it means to be brave. Your great-grandfather brought his family home." Maya fastened the chain back around her neck. The metal was warm against her skin. It was her history, and it was her future. The billionaire who had built an empire to wall himself off from the world had finally, in the twilight of his life, found his way back in. He had lost a son, but he had found a family. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he was finally, truly, rich. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.